Для меня большая честь и радость представить нашего следующего докладчика. Это профессор Юэн Боуи, профессор Оксфорда, и это настоящий профессор Оксфорда, потому что, насколько я знаю, он проработал в Оксфорде с 1965 года по 2007 в одном университете. И это Оксфорд, и это Корпус Кристи колледж. И то, что в 2007 году он отошел от активного преподавания, не значит, что он не продолжает быть оксфордским профессором. Он Emeritus Fellow of Корпус Кристи. И это один из ведущих специалистов, я бы сказал, вообще по классической литературе в мире, писавший о самых разных темах. Он занимался архаической греческой лирикой, Аристофаном, прозой поздней античности и второй софистикой. В последние годы его интересы лежат прежде всего в области античного романа. Количество его статей даже невозможно назвать. Количество его выступлений в течение года невозможно посчитать на пальцах в разных конференциях по всему миру. Он в 2009 году вместе с Андре Лординуа создал международное общество по изучению, ну, мы бы сказали, античной лирики, хотя это называется Ancient Song. То есть теперь все по милической поэзии, но и не только. И сейчас все с нетерпением ожидают, когда выйдет комментарий, который пишет профессор Боуи на роман Лонга «Дафнис и Хлоя». So it's my pleasure and honor to give the floor to Professor Юэн Боуи.
Thank you, Nikolai, for inviting me here and for the excellent organization that characterizes this conference as it did the one I enjoyed 2 years ago. And thank you for your introduction, as long as it didn't say I was Paulos, which I suspect it did not. And I must add a sentence which is not in the translation about my paper. It is taxonomic rather than argumentative. I like argumentative papers, but this is not really one of them. And those who do not like taxonomic papers should go to sleep. Our Greek prose texts of the Roman Empire are our richest source of information on archaic lyric, elegiac and iambic poetry. And they were the basis, the quotations there were the basis of the corpora assembled by modern scholars from as early as Angelo Poliziano in the second half of the 15th century, right up to the exciting new light cast on poetry by papyri from Egypt in the 19th century, and of course since. Between Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Himerius, we have a range of literary, philosophical, sophistic and technical texts written by men who often had access to full editions of these poets and knew and respected their work. Some of these texts cited poems or fragments without literary comment, as do the metricians, or as Athenaeus frequently does. But often evaluation accompanies citation. And in this short paper, only a rough sketch with some examples will be possible. The critical comments we encounter can be divided into two broad categories. Category 1, criticism directed towards a correct reading of the text. Category 2, criticism which picks out the stylistic effects at which a text aims and examines how and to what extent it achieves these effects. I pick out within category 1, and you will see these categories at the top of your handout without numbers. I pick out within category 1 2 subcategories, and within category 2 3 subcategories. In category 1, the first subcategory is the claim of anagoresis, as made by Heraclitus in his Homeric allegories. Subcategory 2, 1b, is judging texts by their moral value, not by their literary value. And this is dominant in discussion of lyric and of other sorts of poetry by rhetor philosophers like Dio of Prusa and Maximus of Tyre, but is also prominent in the philosopher Plutarch. Category 2, with 3 subcategories. 2a, the identification of charis, charm, and also of identification of sweetness and how it can be achieved, such as we find in Demetrius and in Hermogenes' Periidion. 2b, the identification of grandeur or sublimity and an analysis of how it is achieved, as by Longinus in Perihypsus. A third subcategory would be the identification of the smooth style called by Dionysius of Halicarnassus Glaphyros, but today constraints of time mean that I shall say nothing of Dionysius at all, only in passing. My apologies to fans of Dionysius, I'm sure there are several. First then, 1a and 1a1 indeed, Anagoresis and Archaeus. The chief witness in this period to criticism of Archaeus is Heraclitus, whose Homeric allegories present fragments 6 and 208 as examples of allegory, preceded, as we saw yesterday, by Archilochus and followed by Anacreon. And I have put the Greek text on the handout, page 1. There is an English translation on page 2. And since Sergei took us through the archaic and anacreontic pieces, indeed Archilochus as well, yesterday, I don't think I really need to take us through the Greek text in detail, and I shall assume that you are familiar with what is said there in the Greek text. Papyri have, of course, added to our text of both these Archaeus fragments, and note on handout number 2 the additions, and also a comment in an Oxyrhynchus papyrus with the name Myrcilo in the margin below line 31, seems to show that Heraclitus was not the only Greek to read this poem allegorically, and that is also apparently shown for fragment 2.8 Voigt by a commentary from Oxyrhynchus, fragment 305 Voigt. Also Horace, handout number 3, in his poem beginning O navis referent in merite novi luctius, shows that he knew an allegorical interpretation, though, as I argued here 2 years ago, he also knew a non-allegorical interpretation, as is shown by another poem in Odes 132, and both of these are handout number 3, the poem beginning Lesbio primum modulati kiwi, well, not beginning but lines 5 following, and there the phrase sivi jactatam relegara udo litre navim establishes, I think, that Horace knew an interpretation of the Navis poem of Archaeus which was not allegorical. So there are different ways of reading this poem in Heraclitus' time, and it is interesting, I think, that Heraclitus offers no argument in favour of his interpretation. He slips in an ad hominem explanation of why Archaeus might have chosen this particular allegory. He is an islander, and being an islander limits his literary imagination and results in excessive use of this single image. And Heraclitus drives this point home by using a related image of the poet's own compositional practice. The poet is at sea, thalatue. The poet is in the sea himself. Apart from this, in Heraclitus, other criticism of Alcaeus in this period is hard to come by, though, like Sappho, he is chosen by Demetrius as an example of charis, item 4 in the handout. In Alcaeus' case, charis of lexis, of language, which is achieved by the use of metaphor. By contrast, Alcaeus is not mentioned at all by Dio of Prusa, and though he does get half a dozen mentions in Plutarch, these are mostly to support an argument, and none enters into evaluation of the passage for either its moral or its aesthetic qualities. I move then to Anaxagoras and Anacreon. Anacreon, the third poet in Heraclitus' examples from early non-hexametric poetry, that is back to page 1 of the handout. And here a modern critic would be likely to render Heraclitus' term elegoresen in some way that involved the term double entendre. Both senses are running in parallel, and to indicate Anacreon's poem in a long list of texts where bodily parts and sexual activities are referred to indirectly, a subject excellently treated 40 years ago by Geoffrey Henderson. As Anacreon's play with sexual double entendre in this fragment and in others, and the playful tone of much of his transmitted sympathetic poetry, made him vulnerable to criticism which expected moral improvement from poetry. And that is my cue to move over to 1b, the practice of judging texts by their moral value. And here I take as my first example Dio of Prusa, and in particular his second kingship oration, handout 5, gives you some of the evidence. Here Alexander is represented speaking to his father Philip, and he tells Philip the poetry of Sappho and Anacreon is not suitable for kings to sing. They should sing Stesichorus and Pindar. So far, so good. But later, Alexander goes on to say what sorts of prayer kings should offer, handout 6. And he advocates the sort of prayer for victory and destruction of Troy made by Agamemnon, king of all the Greeks, Basileus, Ton, Panton, Helenon, in the Iliad. Not, he says, the likes of Anacreon's sympathetic prayer, which begins Ornax or Damales Eros. And I put the whole item 7 on the handout with an English translation opposite it. Or, he says, the subtly erotic Attic Scholia, which I have there in item 6 in the handout, which are also known to us from Athenaeus, and presumably are known to Dio and his audience or readers from precisely that collection of Attic Scholia that Athenaeus used a century later. I think that here Dio is not dealing his character Alexander a fair hand, since what Dio does is quote the whole of this 11-line poem. It looks as if it is complete, to illustrate why it's something you should not sing if you're a king. It is rather surprising that the moralistic Dio gives his moralistic character Alexander a full quotation of a poem which is undoubtedly a prayer for success in the seduction of a beautiful boy, Cleobulus, however one interprets the detail. And I think that the way the soi-disant bellicose Alexander recites the whole of this poem to his father, and then follows it up with the fantasies of being a liar carried by beautiful boys with a catharon non, or a jewel worn by a beautiful woman, is a light touch to amuse the sunatoi in Dio's Greek audience. Neither Alexander nor Trajan, for whom he is here offered as an exemplum, is as single-mindedly devoted to the pursuit of martial virtus as they might at first seem. And I think it might be relevant to what Dio is doing that Trajan had a reputation for pursuing young boys, Miracia, evidence on handout number 8. So Dio is doing a bit of a tease here. Another author, judging texts by their moral value, is Plutarch. Like Dio, a philosopher, he regularly judges poetry by its moral effect. That, of course, is the predominant message of the De Poetis Audiendi, but in other contexts too, he bases critical judgment on moral considerations. Thus, Anacreon is criticized in Plutarch's Amatorius for his evocation of an arrow's shimmering desire and loaded with perfumes. And 10 gives you the text. Now, this is not to say that Plutarch did not recognize the quality of Anacreon's poetry, as indeed he recognized the quality and power of that of Sappho, with whom he sometimes couples Anacreon. See handout 11. This also emerges from the passage at the opening of the Pericles, where Plutarch asserts that a gifted youth would not want to be a Phidias or a Polycletus because of the pleasure given by their sculptures of Zeus or Hera. This is handout 12. Nor to be Anacreon, Philetas or Archilochus because pleased by their poems. There is a problem here about the text, which I pass over. For it is not necessary, Plutarch says, that if an artifact gives pleasure by its charm, the craftsman is worthy of serious attention. So the moral turn has led Plutarch here into some interesting reflection on the nature of works of art. And it shows that for Plutarch, Anacreon's poems do deserve respect as works of art, which is perhaps confirmed, item 13, by a remark of his character Philippus in Quaestiones Convivales, seeing that even when Sappho and the poetry of Anacreon is being sung, I decide to put down my wine cup out of respect. That opening of the Pericles also shows that for Plutarch, Anacreon's poems are a source of pleasure arising from their charm, their charis, and I now make a transition to assessment of charis, taking me to Demetrius and Hermogenes. And I pass over the problem of the chronology of Demetrius and will simply suppose for the moment that he is part of the same world as the others I've been talking about. Demetrius offers several ways in which charis can be achieved. Thus, at 140, he gives his readers 3 citations from Sappho's Ectalamia, and at 14, illustrating how it can be achieved by duplicatio and anaphora. And indeed, Sappho is Demetrius's primary example of a poet who exhibits charis. And I look next at a sequence in Demetrius that teases out the difference between the humorous and charming, first citing Sappho phrases that illustrate the charis that comes from hyperbole. This is on handout 15. And I move to section 166 and will simply read through briefly the English because it is illuminating here. 166 to 168 of Demetrius. This is why Sappho sings of beauty in words which are themselves beautiful and attractive, or of love or spring or the halcyon. Every beautiful word is woven into the texture of her poetry, some she invented herself. but it is in a very different tone that she mocks the clumsy bridegroom and doorkeeper at the wedding. Her language is then very ordinary, in a diction of prose rather than poetry. So these poems of hers are better spoken than sung, and would not suit the accompaniment of a chorus or a lyre, unless you could imagine a chorus that speaks prose. But the main difference is in their purpose. The writers of charm and comedy do not share the same purpose. One aims to give pleasure, the other to make us laugh. And they also differ in their results, laughter in one case and praise in the other. There's a lot of interesting and I think perceptive thought here in Demetrius, as there is too in how he had gone on earlier, handout 16, in chapter 132, where he sees Charis as coming from subject matter. The charm may lie in the subject matter, such as the gardens of the nymphs, marriage songs, loves, or the poetry of Sappho generally. Such themes, even in the mouth of Acaponax, have charm, and the subject has its own graceful likeness. Nobody could sing a marriage song in frenzied anger, nor could style change love into a fury or giant, or laughter into tears. And he goes on to show how Charis can be achieved by a whole number of different means. I put them in handouts 17, 18 and 19, repetition, comparison, change of stance. It seems that for Demetrius, Sappho can do no wrong. And at one point he even picks out exaggeration, a feature that in other writers creates or risks, psychrates, frigidity, and he commends Sappho for exploiting exaggeration successfully. That's at 127. So Sappho is really up there at the top in Demetrius's table. So too, in the case of Hermogenes, Sappho is an important witness. I now move to Hermogenes. Hermogenes cites Sappho twice, first to exemplify how the description of things themselves pleasurable, constituents of a locus of moinis, gives pleasure. And at number 21 gives you the Greek text. The English, in addition to these, though, there's another kind of thought that involves pleasure and sweetness, one which has a different impact on different occasions. Well, this kind often has more impact even than telling actual myths, but often is less effective than those that occupy the third place. Its operation is as follows. Everything that is pleasant to our senses, I mean to sign, touch, taste, or any other source of enjoyment, also create pleasure when spoken. Now, some of the pleasures that come from enjoyment are immoral, but others are not. And it is possible simply to describe those that are not immoral, such as the beauty of a place, and the variety of plants, and a diversity of streams, and that sort of thing. For these both impart pleasure through sight and seeing, and through hearing when somebody enunciates them, like Sappho, and he then quotes a bit of fragment 2, of which we know much more from Ostracon. And all that is said before and after this. And this is the sort of thing also found in Plato's Phaedrus, such as, and he then quotes the Phaedrus. Another road towards sweetness identified by Hermogenes is ascribing volition to inanimate objects, which he cites item 22 and the handout. As to other lyric poets, Hermogenes notes that Stesichorus too is hagios, sweet, because of his use of many epithets, and he twice mentions Anacreon as a poet whose expression has simplicity, aphileia, though without giving an example. Archilochus strangely is cited for the running effect of tetrameters, and 25. By contrast, Hermogenes makes no use of Alcman, Archaeus, Ebicus, Calinus, Monernus, or Tertius. And he mentions Simonides only in discussing the reference to him by Theocritus 16 and 27. And Hermogenes was not enthusiastic about Pindar in the section on metaphor, countering against excess. He notes that Pindar, like the tragedians, is in danger of going too far, item 28 on the handout. So in these two critics, Demetrius and Hermogenes, we're getting a fairly narrow range of choice of archaic poets, choosing, of course, the ones that suit their own purposes. So, in my concluding section, I return to the third of Heraclitus's allegorists, Archilochus, though not to say anything more about fragment 105, rather to consider the high regard in which Archilochus is held by the author of the Sublime. With 3 appearances there, he is the most mentioned of the early non-hexametric poets. The one mentioned is simply his characterization as the Melicortatos, which also allows Stesichorus his only appearance. Simonides too is mentioned only once, but more informatively, for the vividity of his description of Achilles' ghost appearing at his tomb as the Greeks prepared to leave Troy. If only he had that poem. Maybe we shall do one day. Anacreon is mentioned only once for the metaphorical use of Thracian mare, and he gets at least a quotation, Ucte Brachies Epistra Famae. Achilles and Pindar are mentioned, but without quotation, in the important passage, section 33 of Pericupsus, which notes the indubitable superiority of first-rate poets, Homer, Archilochus, Pindar, Sophocles, over highly competent second-rate poets, Apollonius, Eratosthenes, Achilles, and Chios. And here, what are highlighted as features of Archilochus' poetry that Longinus really admires are its capacity to sweep along much unmanageable material and that outpouring of divine inspiration which is hard to discipline. We have the whole of that text, item 29 on the handout. It's a fairly well-known text. I will not use time going through it. Longinus also praises, item 30 on the handout, Archilochus for the sublimity of his handling of a shipwreck. An allusion so brief that it's not clear what features of Archilochus' poem struck him, but one was very probably his effective selection of the direst features of the sailor's situation, ton paraculithonton ta calaportata. But Longinus' most sustained and illuminating critical discussion is, of course, that of Sappho, fragment 31, to which he remains our chief witness. Sappho, fragment 31, also by sheer contingency, happens to be 31 on handout. I won't quote the poem itself, which is so well known, but I will read through the comments of Longinus. Well then, let us see whether we can find anything else that can make style sublime, since with all things there are associated certain elements inherent in their substance, it follows of necessity that we shall find one factor of sublimity in a consistently happy choice of those constituent elements, and with the power of combining them together, as it were, into an organic whole. The first procedure attracts the reader by the selection of ideas, the second by the density of those selected. Sappho, for instance, never fails to take the emotions incident to the passions of love from its attendant symptoms and from real life. And wherein does she show her excellence? In the skill with which she selects and combines the most striking and intense of these symptoms. He then quotes 31 and goes on afterwards, is it not wonderful how she summons at the same time soul, body, hearing, tongue, sight, skin, all as though they had wandered off apart from herself. She feels contradictory sensations, breezes, burns, raves, reasons, so that she displays not a single emotion, but a whole congeries of emotions. That is the translation by Hamilton Fyfe, revised by Russell from the Lower. Well, so much for a schematic overview, and I apologise for the very schematic nature of what could be a much longer and more complex analysis. Several of these prose texts are aimed at training orators, Dionysius, whom I didn't have time to include, Hermogenes certainly, but presumably, in my view, Demetrius, though that is perhaps debatable. And so one big question arises, which I would like to ask. The obvious models for stylistic imitation by orators are orators. Above all, for Dionysius and Hermogenes, Attic orators. Why are archaic poets writing in other dialects than Attic adduced as exemplars when we're trying to explain to orators how to be good orators? Part of the explanation may be that it is easier for Demetrius to find charis and Hermogenes to find sweetness, tahedi, in these poems than in the orators. But some of their examples are drawn from oratory, and certainly Longinus had no reason to leave oratory to find cases of sublimity. Rather, I think two related phenomena are in play. First, the superpepadumenos is displaying his superior paideia. He is going beyond the more limited range of authors read at school, or even by many young men who study rhetoric. Of iambic poets, Quintilian recommends only Archilochus. Of lyric poets, only Pindar, enthusiastically, Stesichorus, dismissively, Archias, but only for his political vehemence, and Simonides for his Jucunditas and evocation of pity, Miseratio. In item 32, item 32 in the handout has the Quintilian reference. There is no mention in Quintilian of Sappho, Oedipus, or Anacreon. You don't need to read these people if you're going to become an orator in Quintilian too. Take Statius, himself a poet with a Greek background. He sets himself apart by claiming of the lyric poets his father had him read Achaemenid, Sappho, Stesichorus, Oedipus, Pindar, Corinna, handout 33. Not what everybody read, but he was special, and he had a rhetor father who knew what he needed for a good career as a poet. So that is one game that is being played. The superpepadumenos is showing that he has superior paideia to the others. But there is also, I think, and with this I close, some flaunting of the complexity of Greek cultural identity for readers and users of the text who, in Dionysius's and Longinus's case, are explicitly named Romans, and who, in other cases, certainly included Romans. The message is that Greece not only had oratory in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, when the Roman Republic was still very young and Latin oratory had hardly begun. Greece had outstanding lyric poetry in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, when Rome was still governed by kings and had very little culture at all. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for very rich paper going over a number of both critics and poets. Questions, comments, вопросы, замечания, соображения? while people are thinking, my question concerns the last part of your paper. I was very fascinated by the idea of these 2 points being in play. Well, do you think that actually it was kind of, in a sense, teasing the Roman audience with the, big Greek culture? Or perhaps there was still a tradition always to refer to Greeks when you are, making a scholarly treatise. Cicero is usually using Greeks as an example, for instance, in his oratorial treatises for a long time, and then can say, okay, why we're speaking so much about Greeks, now we'll turn to Romans. So it's not kind of teasing, I think it's kind of, just established tradition. So it wasn't kind of, pushing Romans to the fact that Greece had long cultural traditions when you were just, barbarians or something like that. It was kind of interplay between the tradition and maybe some idea of, as you underlined it. In the second, it's just a curious remark. And a question about quoting lyric poets in treatises on oratory. I just don't know, but did you, I think you did you just look which poets are quoted by Greek orators, or do they quote them a lot? So the idea of quoting lyric poetry, was it actually extant in Greek oratory or not? So maybe that could be the reason for them to just return to lyric poetry. Я быстро суммирую свои вопросы. Первый касается того, что вот была ли эта идея указывать на глубину греческой культуры, обращаясь к римской публике, обязательно, такой вызывающий по отношению к римской публике, или все-таки существовала такая долгая традиция, как Цицерон всегда сначала долго говорит про греков, потом говорит, что греки ничего не понимали, и теперь или не все понимали, а теперь обратимся к римлянам. Он, конечно, не фраппировал свою аудиторию этим. А второй вопрос, цитируют ли греческие ораторы, если цитируют, то кого из греческих лириков, и было ли это возможной причиной для того, чтобы в трактаты об ораторском искусстве включалась лирика?
Well, thank you very much. On the first point, I think one has to distinguish, as you perhaps implicitly were, between what a Latin rhetorical writer is proposing, where, as you say, it is traditional from the early 1st century up to Radhavendian onwards, to make some reference to Greek poets. And in the case of these Greek texts, intended for a Roman reader, as well as, of course, for Greek readers, I would expect a different perspective, and the decision a writer of Greek text has to make is which parts of Greek culture they're going to foreground in their proposals for learning rhetoric. On the second question, I wasn't sure when you said when Greek orators quote lyric poets, were you talking about the classical period, or you were talking about in the imperial period?
Both.
Okay. In the classical period, there's a remarkably little quotation of poetry in Attic oratory, and some of it may have come into in the manuscript transmission. So Tyrtaeus is one of the few examples of Tyrtaeus and Solon are quoted both, I think, in the year 330 BC, along with some epigrams. But lyric poetry, no. When you get to the imperial period, I mentioned Dio, and he is our only example of a Greek orator from the late 1st, early 2nd century, and very little quotation there of the When we get later in the 2nd century, an exception is there in Elias Aristides, but in a particular speech, that is Elias Aristides 28, where he is trying to defend himself on the ground of having praised himself, and he runs through a whole range of Greek authors, both poets and prose authors, who have praised themselves. And so Aristides 28 gives us more quotations of Greek lyric poetry or other early Greek poetry than any other 2nd century orator. When you get to Maximus of Tyre, he's playing around with Sappho principally, partly because he has this game about Sappho and Socrates. So in each case when we find a focus in Greek oratory of the 2nd century on lyric poetry, it's for a specific purpose. It's not just what you do in the way that in the 19th century in the British House of Commons people would quote Horace as a matter of course.
Значит, что касается первого, то профессор Боуи полагает, что все-таки следует различать римлянина, пишущего для римской аудитории, и грека, пишущего для, то есть автора греческого текста для римской аудитории. Во втором случае идея, так сказать, выдвижения греческого на первый план и подчеркивания всего богатства греческой традиции приобретает иной несколько смысл с его точки зрения, чем просто обычные ссылки на греческий опыт для римских авторов. Что же касается цитирования ранней поэзии у ораторов, то в классическом периоде у аттических ораторов практически не встречаются цитаты. Исключение, пожалуй, составляют Солон и Тиртей. Если мы дальше, был упомянут Дион Хризостом, но вообще, по мнению, в более позднем периоде в действительности, по мнению профессора Боуи, всякий раз, когда авторы уже периода империи цитируют греческую поэзию, прежде всего лирическую поэзию, это диктуется специальными задачами конкретной речи. Например, 28-я речь Элия Аристида, где он цитирует много поэзии, лирической поэзии, больше, чем кто-либо вообще в II веке. Это продиктовано тем, что он защищается от обвинения, что он превозносил сам себя, и в связи с этим перечисляет всех, кто превозносил сам себя, а таких было много. У Максима Тирского тоже специфическая задача, которая обыгрывается его, почему он, так сказать, специально обращается к образу Сафо. Поэтому с точки зрения профессора Боуи действительно не было, так сказать, у ораторов вообще, так сказать, распространенной практики цитирования лирических поэтов, они не считали это необходимым для демонстрации ораторского стиля.
I have a question just to follow Professor Green's question. So might it be possible that the reason for early orators not quoting from lyric poetry is because, well, you couldn't just recite it, so you had actually to sing it?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last phrase.
Well, the reason be that you couldn't, in the early times, you couldn't just read Melic poetry, so you had actually, so if you...
To sing it?
Yes, yes.
Do you want to translate that?
Вопрос касался, вот, собственно, почему отеческие ораторы не цитируют лирическую поэзию, потому что в классической традиции оратору вообще затруднительно цитировать лирическую поэзию по причине того, что ее нельзя просто произносить, ее надо петь.
I think that is a very good point. We don't really know, I think, when people stopped singing Melic poetry in a symphonic context. It's clear that choral public poetry, like the Delphic hymns, were sung right down, but by the time of the 2nd century AD, Plutarch and Gellius think that choral performance of sung performance of Sappho and Anacreon was unusual rather than unusual. On the other hand, the fact that Lycurgus is quoting Tyrtaeus and Demosthenes is quoting Solon, both elegiac poets whose poems were being sung, I would think, as late as sometime in the 4th century, might indicate that you had the choice of reading out
Right.
from a text
I mean,
a poem that would otherwise be sung.
Right, but I mean, isn't it took different kinds of singing when you sing elegiac poetry and when you sing melodic poetry? So the first
Well,
one would be closer to.
That is currently a hot matter, as you probably know, and a recent article in Journal of Hellenic Studies by Tim Power and Felix Budelmann has argued that there is a sort of intermediality of the performance of elegiac between spoken and sung. I'm not sure I believe them. I'm not sure it can be demonstrated that I am wrong or that they are wrong. And the evidence is difficult.
Да, значит, по мнению профессора Боуи, это такой очень хороший вопрос. К сожалению, мы не можем сказать, когда милическая поэзия перестала, в принципе, петься в контексте, за столом, в контексте симпозиума. Мы, да, знаем, что, конечно, были публичные постановки, публичное исполнение дельфийских гимнов, хотя уже ко II веку там исполнение хором Сафа, например, становится скорее непривычным. С другой стороны, тот факт, что Ликург цитирует Тертея, а Демосфен цитирует Солона, а по мнению профессора Боуи, Солон и Тертей, вообще ведическая поэзия, пелась в IV веке до нашей эры, свидетельствует о том, что это не так важно. На это было сделано замечание, что не означает ли, что все-таки исполнение элегической поэзии и исполнение милической поэзии могло быть разным. На это профессор Боуи ответил, что это чрезвычайно горячая тема для обсуждения в данный конкретный момент. Недавно появилась статья Тима Пауэлла и Феликса Будельмана, в которой они стремились показать, что элегия — это нечто, по исполнению, это нечто среднее между обычной речью и милической поэзией. Профессор Боуи полагает, он им не верит, но полагает, что нельзя абсолютно доказать ни то, что они правы, ни то, что он прав. Поэтому в данном случае вопрос субъюдится. Кэтрин?
Well, thank you very much for this paper. It's a really interesting organization of the material that's very helpful for us, I think. I wanted to revisit your sort of premise that the works of Demetrius, and I think you also included Dionysius, are strictly attempts to educate orators. Because I mean, it seems to me that that's at least arguable as the only purpose for these texts, because certainly we have rhetorical treatises that do that specifically, and these texts are doing a great deal that we don't find in rhetorical treatises, particularly the analysis of poetry. And of course Demetrius does not have an introduction where he really explains the audience, and he doesn't have a conclusion where he explains really what he's trying to do, so we have to make our own judgments. But also, both of them, I think it's clear now, rely on sources that, yes, are partly from the rhetorical tradition, but are also partly not from the rhetorical tradition. I mean, the famous analysis of Dionysius of Sappho is obviously coming from the euphemists, who are strictly concerned with poetry and poetic criticism and not with rhetoric. And Demetrius has a very interesting section in his before he gets to the styles, in which he carefully wants to explain what ethumene means in his context, which is not the rhetorical use as argument, but rather it's a particular stylistic device that's like an argument, but isn't necessarily an argument. It's like a syllogism, but it isn't rhetorical in nature. So he's distinguishing between certain elements of prose style that we're just talking about there, in rhetoric, and then more generally, or one might assume in other literary contexts. So yeah, I just want to see how you
Okay.
how you react to that.
Значит, вопрос профессора Гуцвиллера касался вот, собственно, предположения и утверждения профессора Боуи относительно того, что Деметрий и Дионисий, произведения Деметрия и Дионисия являются прежде всего сочинениями, направленными для обучения ораторов. В действительности, по мнению профессора Гуцвиллера, это довольно спорно, да, поскольку они, конечно, содержат в себе определенную часть того, что входило в риторические трактаты, но содержат в себе и много того, что не входило в риторические трактаты. Мы, к сожалению, Деметрий не дал нам ни вступления, ни исключения, чтобы мы вообще узнали о том, что он вообще хотел, но с другой стороны, в последнее время достаточно убедительно было показано, что, скажем, анализ Сафа восходит прежде всего к традиции литературной критики, а не к риторической. Более того, сам Деметрий различает некоторые, в частности, в контексте теории стилей, различает то, что относится, собственно, к риторике, и то, что относится к гораздо более широкому кругу текстов, которые, скорее, все-таки анализировались другими областями, не риторикой, а литературоведческой традицией.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Well, you've seen the very thin ice on which I'm skating, and in my slight defence, I should say that premise is a premise to my speculative conclusions rather than to my analysis. So it had to go, then the speculative conclusions would have to go and be revised. But clearly you're right, there's something much more complicated going on in both Demetrius and Dionysius than simply trading orators. I think the case of Hermogenes is easier to hold. The question then must arise, so what is this other that is going on? Who are they expecting to read their treatises, for what end? And some form of improving the paideia of their audience, I suppose, is to be imagined. And here I would want to try to defend slightly my super paideia, super pepagymnos idea by saying that if you look at what the majority of people learning to write in Greek are learning, judging the work done by Teresa Morgan and Gymnastics of the Mind, and so on. There are poets who are being used, especially Euripides, Homer and Euripides, but these lyric poets are not being used there very much, or in some cases hardly at all. So Demetrius and Dionysius, or whichever order one should think of them as operating, are moving outside the canon, or the narrower canon, and I may have the wrong answer to the question, but I think there is a question why they're doing it.
Да, ответ состоит в следующем. Прежде всего, профессор Боуи, благодарив профессора Гуцвиллера за вопрос, сказал, что она как раз, этот вопрос направлен на тот тонкий лед, по которому вступает в своих предположениях профессор Боуи, и основываясь прежде всего на некоторых общих представлениях, а основываться на общих представлениях — это и хуже, чем стоять на тонком льду. Однако в качестве некоторой защиты своей позиции, он говорит, что да, конечно, Деметрий и Дионисий явно не пишут только для того, чтобы воспитывать оратора, в отличие от Гермогена, где это можно показать с большей определенностью. Однако все равно остается вопрос, зачем они делают все, что они делают, каковы источники, во-вторых, на кого это рассчитано. И здесь профессор Боуи скорее бы все-таки постарался бы защитить свою идею вот этой демонстрации, с одной стороны, собственной суперобразованности, а с другой стороны, расширения образования того круга, к которому они обращаются, поскольку, как показала Тереза Морган в своей книжке «Гимнастика ума», для воспитания, для школьного образования все поэты, о которых говорил профессор Боуи, практически не использовались. Да, все очень много изучали Еврипида, и не только Еврипида, но это не входило в такой классический круг образования, и расширение этого круга как раз и было, возможно, задачей и Деметрия, и Дионисия. Well, I'm afraid that we just went to the limit of the discussion. Thanks again for a very interesting paper provoking a lot of